Hello, Internet. My name is Chamomile.
Cam, untie me.
Okay, I would Requiem, but you keep wandering off, and sooner or later you're gonna leave, and a new co-host with a voice similar, if not identical to yours, will not appear, and then I won't be able to do a show.
It- it- you could have just told me to stop wandering. Like, this is a very elaborate system of knots that you've set up. Like, I don't even know how you did this.
Well, I figured, so long as I'm tying someone up, I may as well practice some shibari. Don't worry about what that word means, and don't look it up on the crystal ball.
I would, but my hands are tied up.
Well, good, because I told you not to look that up. You, it just means very practical utilitarian knots with no other purpose.
Then why? Like, is it necessary that the knots are like tied to the ceiling and I'm just sort of hovering by the mic?
Okay,
Like, this seems excessive.
Like, do you have any idea how impressive that is, though? Like, if you can do a suspended tie at a play party, then you will have, like, every available sub in the building will be lining up. Never mind, backing up. That's not what shibari means. Everything is fine. Don't look it up.
Eventually, I'm going to wriggle out of this, and then we're going to have a long discussion about this. But I guess we'll just do the podcast in the meantime.
It is an unfortunate truth that no tie is ever truly secure. Someone who struggles long enough will eventually loosen the knots, which is why it is always very important to attend to someone to make sure that not only that there is good blood flow, but also to retighten the knots, because it's no fun. I mean, it's insecure to if they start to get loose.
I'm going to gnaw through this one.
That actually usually doesn't work on modern rope.
Yeah, I think I broke a tooth. It's fine. Let's just do the podcast.
Yes. So rather than talking about shibari, which you should not look up, and which is a perfectly ordinary and utilitarian method of tying ropes, and I don't even know what it means anyway, let's talk about Conan. Because you read Conan recently, didn't you? A bit of it.
Yeah, I only read The Tower of the Elephant, but it was interesting.
Before we go any further, if you want to get started reading Conan, you should start with The Tower of the Elephant. It is the classic Conan story. Conan robs an evil wizard for a magical treasure, and swords and sorcery shenanigans ensue. It's just not the Conan story. That implies it's the first, which it is not. It is the archetypal Conan story is the word I'm looking for. Also, I lost a guild fragment in some random part of the place because I was just wandering around. It's fine. I'll get it back. I was low on health because I just beat a boss. Shouldn't have any difficulty getting back there at full health. But yeah. So what did you think of the Tower of the Elephant?
Yeah, so you can definitely see how D&D was influenced by this. Like, it feels like a setup to like a D&D story, despite being like, since I'm tied up, could you look up when the Tower of the Elephant is written?
I want to say 1935, but I am... Okay, look. I will give you the crystal ball, and, I mean, your hands are behind your back, but you can hold it and just commune with it, which I assume is a thing you can do.
Yeah, okay. It's telling me March 1933. So it's like 40 years before D&D comes out, but like it feels like a D&D adventure. Like
Gary Gygax loved Conan, and you can tell.
Like a barbarian meets up with a thief and they break into a wizard's tower to try to steal some treasure. Which is admittedly more early edition D&D. Like I don't think you'd have an adventure like that now, but first and second edition, very much so. That would be an adventure.
Right. Is that like you can really tell early editions of D&D like were mainly written by a guy who loved Conan, and then there were also a lot of people who loved Lord of the Rings and King Arthur, who were like part of the team. And you can actually sometimes even see a little bit of tug of war between them. There's no non-human races in Conan, or at least not player races. They sometimes show up as like antagonists, or even just some weird ally. But they're definitely one-offs to the story. NPCs not a major part of the setting, like D&D elves or dwarves. And
I've always
Gary
kind of wondered
Gygax is
if
super passive-aggressive about this, with, like, race level restrictions and stuff. Like, he allowed elves and dwarves in D&D, but you can tell he really resented having been forced to allow elves and dwarves in D&D.
yeah, I kind of wonder sometimes if his hatred of Lord of the Rings just. I think that probably wasn't there initially. It's just like as time went on and people kept comparing Dungeons and Dragons to Lord of the Rings, his hatred of Lord of the Rings happened. Like I don't think it was there initially, but I think like it came as a result of that being the constant comparison. Which admittedly, like people shouldn't have been comparing it to Conan the Barbarians because like the influence of that is much bigger. But like I think there is that. I don't think he went into D&D hating Lord of the Rings.
I think that's fair, and like I do have sympathy for him of that. Like he made this little Conan simulator, and everyone always only wanted to use it to play Lord of the Rings. His reaction to it, as with his reaction to many things, was not especially healthy or mature. But I do sympathize with his situation.
It's a little similar to how people now will try to constantly compare Game of Thrones to Dungeons and Dragons, even though that's not, almost certainly not an influence. Like any parallels between Game of Thrones and are results of them drawing from the same source materials, not from Martin having been influenced by Dungeons and Dragons. Martin was like 10 years younger than Gygax, I want to say, so they're close to being contemporaries. And like, there's stuff in Dungeons and Dragons that is influenced by Martin.
There's stuff in Dungeons and Dragons that is flat out stolen from Martin.
Yeah.
The Githzerai and Githyanki, those are George R. R. Martin's inventions. They are not licensed from him. And Gary Gygax basically just had the giant brass balls to go and copyright someone else's work. And because the court sure as hell hadn't ever heard of, George R. R. Martin's obscure short story, they bought it.
Yeah. So we mentioned this before.
Mind Flayer is clearly just a Cthulhu starspawn, and like neither the words mind nor flare can be copyrighted or trademarked, and yet that is a product identity creature. Final Fantasy still gets away with using it all the time because Hasbro don't want to fuck with Square, but they will absolutely come after your small press if you try to use this blatantly public domain creature.
Yeah. One creature I have not been able to figure out, if this is stolen from something or if D&D made it up, is the Beholder. Because, the Beholder-type monster comes up in Big Trouble in Little China, but that could also be a reference to the D&D Beholder.
Right.
I don't know which one of those came first.
I do know the Beholder is in D&D pretty early on, so...
If it's in, I think Big Trouble in Little China is... 80s, so it probably was influenced by D&D then. But I don't know if the Beholder, if there is some sort of if it's the Mind Flayer or the Gith or the Displacer Beast is another one where that is just straight up stolen from a story that I don't even know if it's public domain or not, and yet is product identity.
Yeah, the Beholder is the only one that I think D&D might legitimately own, but then I thought they made up the Tarrasque, and they did not, so...
Nope, that's a French dragon. And also the modern design is very much stolen from 1998 Godzilla.
It's true. With that said, the Tarrasque has way more cultural staying power than the 1998 American Godzilla movie, so... I think D&D can safely say that, at least in terms of public consciousness, that is now their design. Which is fair. I think it's entirely okay that, a bad take on Godzilla got turned into a monster that is cool unto itself. That said, Tarrasque should still totally have a breath weapon. Partly because that monster looks like it should have a breath weapon, but also because it's much better balanced with the breath weapon. It's in virtually every edition it's appeared in. It is supposed to be this doom monster, and yet it is almost always fairly easy to kite. It's usually not as straightforward as literally just showing up with a longbow and wearing its HP away that way. It's almost always more clever than that. But it's still, you can almost always kill this thing at like level 3 or whatever with some kind of kiting strategy. Granted that it will take you 200 rounds, and you would not want to actually do that on the table, but in the setting it would be a perfectly effective strategy, and that's a problem. But yeah, so Conan, obviously the inspiration for D&D, particularly early D&D.
So, and obviously, like, since we're discussing Tower of the Elephant, if you haven't read it and you do want to read it, like, there's going to be spoilers in this discussion.
Which, by the way, if you haven't read it, go ahead and read it, like, right now. The Conan copyrights are in a weird place where the character himself is copyrighted, but the original text of the stories is not, so you can read it for free legally.
It is on Wikipedia. That is where I read it.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, I read these all online, but, I found, like, dedicated fan collections, that had some neat Conan-y theme to them. But yeah, ultimately it's not especially long, so I guess it's not a huge surprise that the entire text is just on Wikipedia. Why not?
Yeah, if you go to the Wikipedia page for the Tower of the Elephant, bottom right corner, Wikisource has the original text related to this article, and you can just read the elephant. It's not super long. I don't know the word count. It's got 3 relatively short chapters. So,
I think I copy pasted it into a word processor into Google Docs at one point, just to see, like, specifically to check how long it was, and I want to say it came out to 16 pages. No, I'm below the bridge. Okay.
And so part of where it's a sort of Shakespeare is cliche thing is because it's influenced D&D so much, a lot of the stuff it does that might have been like new when it did it comes off as a little bit predictable and cliche. Like they go to this tower and there's all this mystery about why nobody even ever tries to rob this tower that's just filled with jewels and all sorts of precious things. And you think there's going to be this weird twist to like what is guarding the tower, like some sort of weird magical twist. But then they get into the tower, and inside the tower is a giant spider, which it's like a standard like he rolled on the random encounter table. But like at the time, like I'm sure going into a magic dungeon and just running into a giant spider, like Howard might have come up with that. Like legitimately might have been the first to do that. So at the time, that was probably a lot more shocking than it is in 2020. It's like, oh, it's a giant spider. I was expecting it to be some weird, like, mindfuck thing.
And even if he wasn't the one who came up with it, there was no standard fantasy bestiary yet, because there was no D&D yet, and D&D is what codified that. Which means virtually any fantasy monster would have been at least a little bit weird at the time. Even fantasy monsters that were fairly well known, like if it was a chimera or whatever, people were generally aware of the story of the chimera, but the idea that there's a standard fantasy monster that you might find, as essentially a random encounter in just any random fantasy story, that was not established. So it may or may not have been especially original, but it wasn't a cliche the way it is now.
But so he kills the spider, and I'm not saying that every story has to have a twist. I want to make that clear. Like, especially like people sometimes get caught up in having a twist. Like sometimes stuff should just follow, and there's nothing wrong with just having a standard fight scene. But the way it was written, the lead up made it seem like there was going to be some twist. Like I'm thinking, like if you did a modern version, you either have to de-emphasize there's some weird effect on the tower, or you have to come up with a twist. Like you could just have that's got a giant spider in it, but then you don't emphasize, nobody ever robs the tower because of some mysterious magic effect that is just a giant spider.
Yeah, you could just say nobody ever robs the tower because it's guarded by a giant spider.
But
yeah, it's definitely it's set up like a twist, and it's not. That's a fair criticism. So,
but then it might have been a twist in 1933.
Yeah, like I actually don't know for sure either, but I feel like probably Like, I don't know for sure how much of an impact D&D had on these things, but definitely it feels like to me like having a monster manual full of monsters, standardized fantasy monsters, in a way that probably wasn't the case before. Because, there is no standard set of sci-fi aliens. There are a handful of things like the Greys and the Little Green Men, who are very similar to each other in the first place, who have become, like, sort of standard aliens. But, despite the fact that you can readily identify the local Klingon ripoffs, there is no stock orc in fantasy.
Yeah.
Or there is a stock orc in fantasy. That's from fantasy. There is no stock orc in sci-fi.
Yeah, with science fiction, I think the only like stock creatures are greys. I say some form of the Borg and some form of xenomorph. But
it's a very limited list.
Yeah.
Of recurring creatures. It's only a list of things that have really captured the public imagination. Whereas, in D&D, it has codified these literal manuals full of standard monsters, which has given fantasy a massive list of standard creatures.
So he kills this giant spider. He goes down into the depths of the tower, and there's this statue of this sort of elephant demon man. And it's like, oh, that's why it's called the Tower of the Elephant. And what's really interesting, so the reason Conan is triumphant in the story, so the statue is not actually a statue. It's some sort of like space alien that has been magically imprisoned by this wizard and forced to teach the wizard magic. And the reason Conan is triumphant in the story is because he has this moment of empathy with this trapped alien elephant man, and the alien elephant man, I think, asks him to cut out his heart and take it to the wizard and say a certain thing to the wizard that I guess is like a spell incantation. But like he does it because he sees this elephant alien is suffering. So Conan is this sort of, buff, stereotypical barbarian dude that you would think would be sort of unfeeling and unempathetic. But the centerpiece of the story is his empathy with this alien. That is why he is triumphant, because by doing that, that's what defeats the wizard and allows Conan to escape. Like, it's not what you would expect from like your stock barbarian, but it's one of those things like what we talked with I Am Legend, where this is the codifier, but is also a much more sophisticated take on the trope than a lot of its followers. Because like you would not expect your stock barbarian to be triumphant because of empathy.
Yeah, it's I talk a lot about how Conan has this barbarian code of honor. One of the primary tenets of which is that like slavery is sort of fundamentally abhorrent to him, and that's not like a polemic point that Conan makes. Definitely, it's a theme of the character, and this is one of the places where that theme comes true. Oh, it is wrong to hold this creature captive so that you can, extract magic, so you can learn spells from it. Not that, he actually learned the spells in advance and then imprisoned it, I'm making a hash of this. God damn it. It is wrong to hold this creature captive, right? That is a fate that is dishonorable to inflict upon any foe. If you hate the monster so much, you should be stabbing it in the face. And, it's not like the wizard has no reason to even hate the monster. Nor does Conan, so he doesn't. But Conan, he passes up the opportunity to rob this tower filled with jewels because the wizard is a load-bearing boss and the tower collapses once the elephant kills him. Doesn't kill him, he gets trapped in a gem and chases him forever. He gets his revenge, which is another very Conan-y thing. But yeah. It's worth noting that Conan believes in revenge as a concept. He does not merely seek it out for himself as an impulse. He considers it right to help others to achieve it as well. So yeah, Conan never comes out and says, "Ah, yes, the third law of barbarism: thou shalt not permit the slaver to live," or whatever. But
it's an implicit theme, which is
yeah.
nice. Subtlety in writing is good, as it turns out.
Yeah.
And again, not a place you would expect it from. You'd not have expected it from. You just went right into those spikes.
Yeah, I knew I had to drop down, and I was not expecting spikes there.
I would not have expected it from Conan the Barbarian, but there it is.
Yeah. It's a lot cleverer than many of his later imitators, including people writing later Conan the Barbarian stories. Oops. I'm just going to go and get that flask back real quick. That was a twitch. I just upgraded these flasks so that I have fewer of them, but they heal me for more each individually. That way, I don't have to, because I am vulnerable when using them, so the fewer of them I have to use for the same healing, that's better. That is an upgrade, but it does mean that I lose out on more healing every time I twitch press the F key. But yes, both Conan knockoffs and later writers writing for Conan the Barbarian himself will frequently get it have a much more cult of the badass kind of take on his character. And Conan does slot fairly easily into the cult of the badass. Indeed, he is almost one of its iconic exemplars, but he isn't an archetypal example of it. He isn't a pure example of it, because he does actually have a lot of more depth and nuance to him than, just the straight, being a jerk is the secret to power. Like, the cult of the badass is a complex thing. Google it and watch the video. But,
I've not heard of this.
To briefly summarize, there's a great YouTube video on it, which is where the term comes from. But to briefly summarize, it is basically the idea that the ultimate good is the ability to inflict violence upon other people. Which, obviously, any state that wishes to be able to preserve itself against anyone who wants to change it must be able to, at some level, inflict violence. Like, total pacifism is just not a practical perspective to have on the level of nation-states or even organizations. Genuinely pacifist organizations are able to exist only because they are protected by other non-pacifist organizations. But there is more nuance to it, to, a discussion of when is it right to use violence, than to simply say that, violence is the highest virtue, and, those who can purvey violence successfully are the most virtuous and therefore get to do whatever they want, which is the ultimate takeaway you get from the cult of the badass. Usually not in like an entirely bald-faced, manner. Like, it won't usually be to the extent of like literally saying, "Oh, I am good at violence, therefore I get to do horrible things to you, ha ha ha." But, I'm glad I put that log down. But there is this undercurrent. You get it a lot in propaganda shows of... you get it a lot in... It's taken a lot of hold in American culture, particularly the last 10, 20 years. Of just, the one who is good at violence has, by virtue of getting good at violence, become sort of more morally pure than the civilians. Yeah. And, you can definitely see how Conan fed into that, but it is not actually a pure example of being that. Being good at violence is part of, but not the entirety of Conan's barbarian honor. There's even a few stories, I can't think of any by Howard himself, but there are some stories that I like that sort of contrast Conan against others of, similar barbarian potence, but who lack his moral compass. And one of the things I like about Conan is that, even though he is primarily selfishly motivated, he has a moral compass. there are lines he will not cross. Not for anything. But also, yeah, this is the boss that'll get us into the second half of the game. He is kind of a hard one. I should warn you that I am immortal. Like, you'll probably seriously inconvenience me, for sure, but...
Now, is it worth talking about something while we do this, or do we need to be silent and we'll just cut this out?
I think we should definitely get, we should talk through at least 1 or 2 or 3 iterations of this fight, just because I don't want to be skipping the boss fights completely on air, but, there does come a point where, you've seen the boss, we're just going to skip to the part where I beat it.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's talk through the first couple of attempts, at least.
So what would you consider like a bad Conan imitator?
The Conan novels written in the 80s are the go-to example. There was an era of pastiche in the 60s and 70s where the imitators were actually pretty good. There's a couple of Conan stories, like, oh man, I cannot remember if the Thing in the Crypt was a Howard original or a pastiche. That's how good it is. So, I mean, in fairness, if it was a Howard original, which the more I think about it, I think it may have been. But, I mean, yeah, there are some Conan pastiches that are about as good as the original Howard ones. If you are a Conan fan, then odds are fantastic that your favorite Conan story will be a Howard original. I don't think anyone ever topped Howard writing Conan. Which, broadly speaking, I think that's totally possible to top the original writer writing their own character. But I don't think it's happened to Conan specifically. That said, as time went on, the Cult of the Badass-ish... 2 things happened to Conan. There was number 1, the whole Cult of the Badass thing. There has always been an emphasis on Conan's prowess. He is physically and mentally very strong. Mentally strong in the sense that he has a strong will. He is a barbarian who knows nothing of art or philosophy. But he is very resilient to mental domination and such. And, in his original conception, and as we see in his better imitations, this comes through, like with the choosing to save the elephant and help him get his revenge over... there's his sister. I already stabbed you to death once. Granted, I guess that's not much of an inconvenience for you, is it? You're already dead. This guy isn't as hard as I remember him being. It still might take me several attempts, but oh wow.
You got very close.
Yeah, I spent an entire hour on this guy first time I fought him. Hopefully that won't happen here. But yes, Conan's mental resilience is shown not just in his ability to resist magical effects, like it's a will save, but in that he is able to commit to his unspoken, unwritten barbarian code of honor, even when there is much to be gained from disregarding it. But yeah, the poor imitations, they lose the nuance of that in exchange for just, oh yeah, Conan is just so strong. They'll sometimes even make him dumb. This is a common thing that you get from Conan, is the stupid brute Conan. You get this in 80s stuff a lot.
Now, how did the movies do it? I've not seen either of them, or I guess there's 3, since there's the one in 2010 that I also have not seen.
I have not seen the second Schwarzenegger movie, but I have seen both of the others. The movies are decent examples. The Schwarzenegger Conan movie has absolutely no place in the timeline, right? It is a clearly original reboot of Conan, as things were in the 80s. However, it's a pretty good take on Conan. There are 2 different scenes that I can think of in it that are fuck the 80s scenes. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on them because that's not the main subject of discussion, and, they're bigoted. Let's leave it at that. But, that was the main problem, is just that this was a movie written written and also filmed in the 80s. And it shows. But other than that, it does Conan pretty well. He isn't as clever as I might like him to be, but he does not come across as particularly stupid either. Conan is a cunning and resourceful warrior, is the thing. There are times when he encounters an enemy who is apparently invincible to normal means, but is able to figure out some clever way to use his environment to defeat them anyway. Movie Conan is not that smart, but he is not particularly stupid either, so... and he is even fairly subtle and cunning. He infiltrates the cult of the evil wizard he is hunting down at one point. It's also, Jonestown was fresh in the American psyche, and boy can you tell. The wizard has a Jonestown-style cult, and it's a pretty good example of a Jonestown-style cult.
I do love that scene where the steel is strong, steel is weak, the flesh is strong, and he gets the girl to jump down to her death. I have watched that scene on YouTube.
It's definitely a highlight of the film, and it is very good. Come on, you little bitch. I thought you said you didn't need your help.
Now, what about the Jason Momoa version?
That one tried to fit itself into... I say tried. That one fit itself into the timeline. It has an obvious place within the timeline of the original Howard novels, although it does disregard a lot of what came afterward. By the 2011, that had sort of become the thing of people had noticed there was a lot of extra Conan stories that had been written since then. A lot of them weren't very good. They were out of character for Conan, and so there was basically it became popular to say only the original Howard stories count, because that is a nice, easy way to cut it off without having to judge each story individually, whether or not it's worth keeping. So, I would prefer a more thorough reaccounting of Conan. That does actually go through the trouble of reading each individual story and deciding which ones should be kept and which ones shouldn't. A La Morte de Conan, if you will. I think the process of making, these kinds of compilations of popular characters is a lost art. You used to get them in mythology and legendariums all the time. And mainly due to copyright law, copyright law has caused them to go out of style because you often can't do something like that. Someone whose primary skill is simply understanding which stories are worth keeping is not able to gather up the best ones in that manner. You do sometimes get things like the Machete Order of Star Wars, but those interpretations, because they are unofficial, because they don't have the IP holder's blessing, they are unable to take over and become the understood canon of that fictional universe. Which, by the way, that is how canon used to be managed, and it worked fine. IP is not necessary to this process. We don't need gatekeepers. People will make compilations, and if the compilation is good, that will become the foundation for new stories going forward. You can actually see this happening in microcosm in the SCP Foundation, where they have multiple different canon universes. The requirements for starting your own canon universe are fairly low. And yet, it all just kind of works out. And that's not even a particularly well-managed community, to be clear. But, this isn't hard. This happens automatically in human storytelling. But, yeah. Big, long tangent. You can tell that this is something that irks me. However, getting back on subject, the 2011 movie is an all-new story, but it does fit in with the Howard timeline, and I think it's pretty good. It's a little bit on the nose with Conan's barbarian honor. I believe there is even an explicit line from Conan in the movie, if I'm remembering this right, where he says that no man should have to live in chains. That's not out of character, but it is a little on the nose it's a little bit philosophical for a guy who very specifically doesn't care about philosophy.
Show don't tell, people. Show don't tell.
Right. But like, so I definitely have my quibbles with it, but I do think it's firmly in the category of the post-Howard pastiche, where it fits with the character, and it's pretty good, but it's not going to be anyone's favorite Conan story.
Oh.
No. Oh, God. Oh, God damn it. I was this close to beating this guy with an invisible health bar that had so little health left, but alas, it was too good to be true.
Now, are there any versions of Conan where, like, the author incorporates something weird into it? Like,
well, of course, it wouldn't be a fantasy genre if there weren't someone who had rewritten it to include all of his weird kinks.
Like, what sort of kinks are we talking about? Like,
I mean, you know, you might have a kink, for example, for, like, tying someone up, like, possibly in a really complex way. I don't know why that came to mind first. Don't even worry about it. But yeah, there are the gore books, which, I mean, you would think, for me in particular, it would be two great tastes that taste great together, but let me tell you, that guy is not a very good writer. So the
I've
gore
not read them,
books,
but they've entered the internet legendarium at this point.
I have read one of them. I read one of the later ones, and I mean, I was reading it more for the kink content than for the fantasy. They're not particularly sexy. Like, the guy is definitely trying to be, but partly it's because I find misogyny to be a really repugnant fetish personally. I don't have a grudge against people who have that, right? It is totally possible to think misogyny is a sexy form of humiliating a sub without believing in it as an actual principle, and that is fine. But personally, I have a strong subconscious association with misogyny, with misogynists, and misogynists are pathetic little also-rans who need to draw on the success of all males everywhere in order to feel better about themselves. So, I do not feel powerful taking on that role. Totally breaks the kink for me. I have also, because I am playing a Dark Souls-inspired game, I'm going to do the Dark Souls of kink discussions by discussing my kinks in depth in such a way that is not creepy or disturbing. We will find out in the edit if I've succeeded. But yeah, the Gore series, of course, its kink is extraordinarily misogynist. You know, the author was already a professor in the 70s, so I have no idea, given his age, whether or not he is personally misogynist. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt and assume no, this is just this kink. But, you know, it's entirely possible, given his demographic, that someone will be able to post a quote in the comments where he is like, ah, yes, women are the natural servants of men, or whatever. So, you know, wouldn't be surprised, but I will not make assumptions because I haven't looked into it and I don't know him. So, yeah. According to what I have read, you know, I read one of the later books, but according to internet legend, this was initially a Conan ripoff, at least in the broad strokes of the setting. You know, the wizard in the Tower of the Elephant, he learned magic from a space elephant, who was explicitly some kind of alien, because sci-fi and fantasy were not super delineated back in the 30s.
And that takes a long time, by the way.
Yeah.
Like, even into, like, just as a brief aside, like, even into, like, because science fiction used to be much more dominant in genre than fantasy. So even into, like, the 70s, a lot of authors, when they wanted to write fantasy, they would write a science fiction, they'd write a fantasy section with a science fiction, like, backstory. So, like, Songmaster by Orson Scott Card, or The Dragon Riders of Pern, or, I feel like I'm forgetting an obvious one. Stuff like that, where it's Rokanan's World by Ursula K. Le Guin, where it's basically a fantasy setting, but oh yeah, we got here by spaceship.
Which, I mean, I like that concept. I find that a fun concept, but really only for purposes of blending, like legit blending sci-fi and fantasy together. Might and Magic, by the way, also did this. Most people don't even know that. But the origins of the Might and Magic setting prior to the reboot they did back in Heroes like 6 or 7. I don't really keep track of the series anymore, so I forget when they did this. But before they did the reboot, that setting's origins is that it is a colony of humans taken from Earth, put on a giant ship that like simulated a world and had magic in it for somehow. And so human cultures adapted, forgot their origins, and were then eventually taken by the gods, who were space aliens, and placed on a new world, which became the setting of Might and Magic. Well, the later games at least. The first few games actually took place on the giant spaceship that contained planets in it.
Yeah,
I say planets. It contained continents in it.
Yeah, fantasy used to be considered very disreputable compared to science fiction. The magazine of science fiction and fantasy actually, so that's one of the first places you see the use of the word fantasy to mean a genre. But the way they're using fantasy, they're essentially using it early on to what we would call now horror. They specifically banned sword and sorcery short stories. So it was basically science fiction and horror, even though it's the magazine of science fiction and fantasy, because they were using it to mean something slightly different, because what we would consider fantasy was considered disreputable.
Which I think might be largely Conan's fault. Conan's Imitators' fault more than Conan himself, but in this case, you can't say that Robert E. Howard wasn't guilty of it at all, for sure. Conan is probably less racist than you might have heard, assuming you have heard the same things I have about it, but don't, take that too far. It is definitely racist. Like, it is not. There is its main sin is race essentialism, in that like your human physical race is like your character class in Conan. Different races are inherently good at certain things, which is a super racist thing to do, even if none of the races are like specifically evil. And that is one of the things that the Imitators did latch onto, because it was very easy to understand. So that is one of the things that was easily replicated while the nuance was lost. So I don't know for sure, but I would suspect that particularly in the 70s, when sci-fi in particular was getting very progressive, that fantasy was seen as a regressive alternative.
I mean, the disreputability of fantasy has been a thing for forever. Like, Beowulf was only became part of the canon because Tolkien was able to advocate for it so successfully. But excuse me. But before that, like, because of it's about like fighting monsters, it was sort of considered this dumb little piece of literature rather than an important part of the development of English literature. It was Tolkien's work that sort of made it part of the canon. This has been a thing for a long time. I don't know if I've talked about the novel versus romance distinction, but fantasy, science fiction has been very successful at aligning itself with the novel, which is the more reputable form of the book, whereas fantasy has always been more associated with the romance, which has historically been the disreputable form. And like, obviously, in my opinion, like, this is a dumb distinction, but it is a distinction that was historically made. Like, but yeah. But so like some authors incorporate their kink into their fiction in a way that is really weird or obnoxious. Like, hold on, I've almost got myself out of this. Oh, I got my hand free.
God damn it, I can't retie you while I'm playing the game.
Good example of this that I have read is a Truth series, where this guy very obviously had some sort of femdom thing.
You can get something similar, although not as pronounced, in the Wheel of Time, although people usually forgive those books because, other than that, they are reasonably good. Some people actually quite like them, which is fine. They're not... I have not read much of them. I read the first one and kind of bounced off it, but that had more to do with, oh, do I want to read 14 books of this, rather than, oh my god, I can't stand another page, right? And I do still plan to go back. Like, I'll find the time eventually. Unlike the Sword of Truth, where it's like, haha, no. I have
Not
better things
only-
to do.
Not only is there a very obvious femdom element, because like the enemy empire has this entire like subclass of servitors who are women with like magical BDSM powers. They have these like writing crops, I guess, that they can use to inflict intense pain or intense pleasure.
Anytime you have an implement or a matched pair of implements that can provide either pain or pleasure, you almost guaranteed you're looking at some weird kink thing. And, like, this is my kink. Like, if anyone would be standing up for it, it would be me. But, like, listen, guys. There's a time and a place for this kind of thing. If you want to write an erotic story, I think that blatantly erotic stories should get more press than they do. Like, I think that should be an okay genre to write in. But, like, it should be something you advertise, right? You know? Give people the story you said you were going to give them. Don't get them, 100 pages in to a general mainstream high fantasy and then say, oh, by the way, the Nazgul of this setting are sexy ladies with writing crops that can cause intense pleasure or intense pain. That's not okay.
Well, the thing is, in the Sword of Truth specifically, not only do you have the very blatant femdom element, you also have the fact that it's very blatantly ripped off from the Wheel of Time. Like, you might as well just read the Wheel of Time because you're reading the Wheel of Time in the form of the Sword of Truth. It's the same thing. Like,
you're reading the Wheel of Time if the Wheel of Time was shit.
And also,
I almost had him. This is why he brings his sister out. Okay. That wasn't so bad. He was way worse the first time around.
You also have the fact that the obnoxious objectivist lectures that happen every book, like, it's if Ayn Rand wrote a fantasy novel.
That's actually another thing that, much like, someone's kink can ruin a story because it gets shoved in where it doesn't belong, someone's political beliefs, and I don't think it's wrong to have a political theme to your stories. Many of mine end up with them, but that's because I believe a thing, and that thing comes through in the story I write.
Yeah, I think the best stories, it'll come out as an epiphenomenon as a story, rather than you sat down and you had a political theme, you're trying to write a story around it.
Yeah. I have never heard of, I guess Fury Road, but even then I don't think the idea was to sit down and write a feminist Mad Max story.
But it's just there's obnoxious objectivism, and it's very in your face and blatant, and
doesn't help that it's a
dumb lectures.
Theory.
And there's some weird justification for killing a bunch of peace protesters at one point. It gets dumb. It's dumb.
Is this new? I feel like this is new.
In the very first book, and it got worse as things went on. The very first book, there's this whole thing where the ruler of the kingdom that Richard lives in wants to ban fire, and I think it's supposed to be a metaphor for gun control. But how could a medieval fantasy culture ban fire?
Yeah, that's not a thing. Not only would banning virtually anything require more centralized power than a medieval society could manage, but fire specifically is so necessary to everything that that doesn't work at all.
If you wanted to have a anti-gun control thing, and I'm pro-gun control, but there's stories in real world history that if you wrote them into a fantasy story are going to read as being anti-gun control. In Japan, there was I don't know if it was a shogun or a ruler who convinced the peasant
who banned all weapons from the peasantry because this was immediately after the Sengoku Basara. And so he banned
knows what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
and he said he was going to build a statue of the Buddha out of the swords, and he built a statue of himself. So that's one of those things you could do. If you incorporated that to a fantasy story, it's going to read as anti-gun control. That's something you could do, but like, very poorly written version.
Yeah. It's like I was actually like I felt like I was gonna. I've got to bring this guy up at some point. Was it Tokugawa Ieyasu? I can't remember exactly which guy it was, but because yeah, there was actually a feudal ruler who attempted some form of gun control. So it's clearly not entirely impossible to ban these kinds of things, but with weapons specifically, you can get away with it more because they are so uncommon in the first place.
Then it basically becomes a form of sumptuary law, where only an aristocrat can have a weapon.
Right.
But like, it was dumb, and like it just gets dumber from there. Richard, for some reason, because he's very much like Gary Stu, he at one point he carves a statue so well that it incites a revolution.
I feel like that was the week that the author took up sculpture.
Oh, and one of the books is dedicated to the CIA. Like, I'm not even joking. I think it might just say the American intelligence agency. Like, you dedicated one of your novels to the CIA. But yeah, I think there was a cracked. They photoshopped an image where they changed the cover of one of these Sword of Truth books to Conan the Libertarian.
And as we have discussed, it was a much reduced version.
Yeah, don't read the Sword of Truth. Now, Kim, where did you get so much rope in the first place?
Don't worry about it. Just don't even worry about it.
What do you have in your hand?
I mean, okay, yes, this is a dildo gag, but I'm putting it away. It's fine. Don't look behind you. There's nothing behind you. I just want to verify for you that there is nothing behind you, so that you don't have to look, which you shouldn't, because it would be a waste of effort.